For centuries, the word samurai has been linked with swords, armor, loyalty, and battle. But the real history of Japan's warrior class is much larger than the image of a lone swordsman. Samurai began as provincial fighters who protected land and served powerful families. Over time, they became military governors, castle lords, administrators, scholars, and political leaders. From the late 12th century until the 19th century, military governments shaped much of Japan's politics. Emperors remained important symbols of legitimacy, but shoguns and warrior houses often controlled the machinery of government. The samurai world also changed constantly. An archer on horseback in the 12th century fought very differently from an infantry commander using firearms in the 16th. A samurai official living in peaceful Edo faced very different problems from a warrior during the civil wars of the Sengoku period. This is the story of how a military class rose from the provinces, defeated its rivals, built governments, survived foreign invasions, fought through a century of civil war, unified Japan, and then slowly lost the military role that had created it. It is also the story of how samurai culture survived long after the class itself disappeared. To understand the samurai, we have to begin before the warrior class dominated Japan. During the Heian period, which began in 794, the imperial court in Kyoto stood at the center of elite politics and culture. Court families, especially the Fujiwara, competed for influence around the emperor. Poetry, ceremony, religion, calligraphy, and refined manners became important signs of status. Yet the capital could not control every distant province directly. Across the countryside, large estates expanded, local disputes became common, and officials needed armed men to protect property, collect taxes, escort important people, and enforce decisions. Some of these fighters came from branches of aristocratic families that had moved away from the capital. Others were local landholders who built influence through military service and family alliances. They were not yet a single national class with one fixed code. Their identities were shaped by region, family, service, and opportunity. The court still mattered, but military skill became more valuable as provincial competition increased. By the 11th and 12th centuries, warrior families could command mounted fighters, retainers, and networks of supporters. Two names would become especially important: Taira and Minamoto. Their rivalry would help transform Japan's political system. The early warriors of Japan were closely tied to land. Control of an estate meant food, income, horses, labor, and political influence. Protecting that land required armed followers. Successful families built networks of loyalty that stretched beyond one village or district. Mounted archery became a major mark of elite military skill. A warrior needed to control a horse while using a long asymmetrical bow, often while wearing heavy armor made from small lacquered plates bound together with cords. Swords were important, but they were not always the main battlefield weapon. Early samurai fighting emphasized bows, horses, spears, and close cooperation with retainers. Family reputation also mattered. Genealogies linked warrior houses to prestigious ancestors, and service to powerful patrons could bring new land or official titles. As central authority weakened in some regions, warrior leaders became increasingly important for solving local conflicts. This created a political contradiction. The imperial court depended on military families, yet those same families were building their own power bases. By the 12th century, major warrior clans had enough strength to influence succession disputes at court and to fight for national power. The samurai were moving from the edges of government toward its center. Two warrior families came to dominate the struggle for power in the late Heian period. The Taira, also known as the Haika, rose rapidly under Taira no Kayamori. He used military strength, court appointments, family marriages, and commercial connections to place his clan close to the imperial household. For a time, the Taira seemed to have achieved something extraordinary. A warrior family had entered the highest levels of court politics. Their rivals, the Minamoto, also called the Genji, had deep military roots and powerful connections across the provinces. Earlier conflicts between the clans had already shown that armed families could decide political questions. In 1160, after the Heiji Rebellion, the Taira emerged in a stronger position and many Minamoto leaders were killed or exiled. One of the survivors was Minamoto no Yoritomo, who was sent away from the capital. The Taira appeared secure, but their control created enemies. Opposition grew among rival warriors, court nobles, temples, and members of the imperial family. When a call for resistance was issued in 1180, regional conflict expanded into a much larger war. The struggle that followed became known as the Genpei War. The Genpei War, fought from 1180 to 1185, was not one continuous battle. It was a series of campaigns involving rival warrior networks across Japan. At first, Minamoto no Yoritomo focused on building a secure power base in eastern Japan. Other Minamoto commanders fought in different regions, including the famous Minamoto no Yoshitsune. The war produced battles that later became central to Japanese literature and art. Mounted warriors, archers, infantry, and naval forces all played roles. The conflict also revealed how quickly alliances could change. Local families often chose sides according to land, rivalries, and survival rather than a simple national cause. By 1185, the Taira position had collapsed. The final major confrontation came at Dan no Yura, a naval battle in the Shimonoseki Strait. The Taira fleet was defeated, and many members of the clan died. The child Emperor Antoku also died during the destruction of the Taira cause. Later writers turned these events into powerful stories about loyalty, courage, pride, and the temporary nature of worldly power. Politically, the result was even more important. The Minamoto victory allowed Yoritomo to create a new military government based far from Kyoto. Minamoto no Yoritomo did not simply replace the emperor. Instead, he built a new system beside the imperial court. From his headquarters at Kamakura, far to the east of Kyoto, Yoritomo organized warrior officials who could supervise land and security. In 1192, he received the title of shogun. The word had existed earlier, but under Yoritomo it became connected with a durable military government known as the Bakufu. The emperor and court continued in Kyoto, while the warrior government developed its own institutions. This created a political pattern that would shape Japan for centuries. Yoritomo relied on personal bonds with vassals who expected protection and rewards in return for service. Land disputes, appointments, and military obligations became central concerns of the new order. After Yoritomo's death in 1199, power shifted toward the Hojo family, who governed as regents for later shoguns. The Kamakura system was not a modern centralized state. Authority was shared, negotiated, and sometimes contested. Yet the important change was clear. The warrior class was no longer simply serving the government. Warriors had created a government of their own. Popular images often show samurai as men who spent every day practicing swordsmanship. Real life was broader. A warrior might manage estates, settle disputes, collect income, inspect land, attend ceremonies, hunt, train horses, practice archery, and maintain relationships with relatives and retainers. Military service was one part of a larger social position. Literacy could be useful because legal claims, orders, records, and correspondence mattered. Religion also shaped warrior life. Buddhist beliefs about death and impermanence had strong appeal in a world where conflict could be sudden. Shinto traditions, local cults, and devotion to warrior deities also remained important. Samurai households were family organizations, not just groups of individual fighters. Marriage could secure alliances. Inheritance could divide or consolidate property. Women in warrior families managed households, property, and family interests, and in some circumstances, they could be involved directly in defense. The idea of a single timeless samurai lifestyle is misleading. A 13th-century landholding warrior and an 18th-century urban official belonged to very different worlds. What connected them was membership in a military status order and service within networks of authority. Samurai weapons changed as warfare changed. In the early medieval period, the bow and horse were especially important symbols of elite combat. The Japanese longbow, or yumi, was unusually tall and asymmetrical. A skilled mounted archer needed years of training to use it effectively. Armor was designed partly for this style of warfare. Large shoulder guards protected the upper body while allowing a warrior to shoot from horseback. Swords were carried, but the famous katana was not the only type of blade used across samurai history. Earlier warriors used forms such as the tachi, often suspended edge down from the belt. Spears became increasingly important as infantry warfare expanded. The naginata, with a curved blade mounted on a pole, was also used in several periods. Weapons were practical tools, but they also carried social meaning. Fine swords could be treasured family objects. Armor displayed rank, wealth, craftsmanship, and identity. By the 16th century, battlefields filled with larger infantry formations and firearms. Armor became more compact and sometimes incorporated heavier metal plates. The samurai tradition survived because it adapted rather than remaining frozen in one style of combat. In the 13th century, Japan faced a threat unlike the internal wars that had shaped the warrior class. The Mongol Empire had expanded across much of Eurasia, and the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan demanded that Japan submit. When diplomacy failed, an invasion force crossed from Korea in 1274. The attackers landed in northern Kyushu, where Japanese defenders confronted unfamiliar tactics and weapons. Later accounts emphasize differences between individual samurai combat traditions and the more coordinated fighting of the invading forces, though the reality was complex. The invaders used bows, infantry formations, and explosive projectiles. Japanese warriors resisted around Hakata Bay and nearby areas. After intense fighting, the invading force returned to its ships. A storm struck during the withdrawal and damaged the fleet. The invasion had failed, but the Kamakura government could not assume the danger had passed. Fortifications were strengthened along the coast, warriors were mobilized, and preparations continued for years. This created a serious financial problem. Defending the country did not produce newly conquered land that could easily be distributed as rewards. Samurai had performed costly service, but the government had fewer resources with which to compensate them. A much larger invasion followed in 1281. Two major forces were organized, one from Korea and another from southern China. Japanese defenders had spent years preparing. A defensive stone wall had been constructed around key parts of Hakata Bay, limiting easy landing points. Samurai launched repeated attacks against enemy positions and ships, while the invaders struggled with coordination and supply. The campaign lasted longer than the first invasion. Then severe weather struck. A powerful typhoon destroyed or scattered many ships. Later Japanese tradition called the storm a divine wind, or kamikaze. The storms became famous, but they were not the only reason the invasion failed. Japanese resistance, coastal defenses, logistical problems, delays, and the difficulty of sustaining a large overseas invasion also mattered. The victory protected Japan from Mongol conquest, yet it placed new pressure on the Kamakura system. Warriors expected recognition for their service. Because the war had been defensive, there was little new territory to grant. Financial disputes and dissatisfaction added to other political tensions. The shogunate survived for another half-century, but the balance holding the warrior government together was becoming harder to maintain. By the early 14th century, the Kamakura shogunate faced problems it could not easily solve. The Hojo regents had maintained political control for generations, but their authority depended on managing a complicated network of warrior interests. Some families were dissatisfied with rewards and land decisions. Others resented the power concentrated around the Hojo. Emperor Go-Daigo tried to restore direct imperial authority and found support among warriors who saw an opportunity to change the political order. In 1333, powerful military leaders turned against the Kamakura government. One of them, Ashikaga Takauji, had originally been sent to suppress imperial resistance, but changed sides. Another force under Nida Yashisada attacked Kamakura itself. The city fell, and the Kamakura shogunate came to an end. For a brief period, Go-Daigo attempted to rule directly through what became known as the Meiji Restoration. It did not last. Many warriors believed the new government favored court interests and failed to satisfy military supporters. Takauji broke with the emperor, defeated his opponents, and established another warrior government. Once again, the question was not whether warriors would influence politics. The question was which warrior house would control the system. Ashikaga Takauji established a new military government in Kyoto in the 1330s. This shogunate is usually associated with the Muromachi period, named after the Kyoto district where later Ashikaga shoguns had their headquarters. The political structure differed from Kamakura. Powerful regional military governors, or shogo, gained considerable influence, and the central government often had to bargain with them. For several decades, Japan also had rival imperial courts, one in Kyoto and another in Yoshino. The courts were reunited in 1392, but political competition remained. Some Ashikaga shoguns were highly effective patrons of diplomacy, religion, architecture, painting, and tea culture. Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, for example, combined political authority with extraordinary cultural ambition. Yet the shogunate's military control was never absolute. Regional warrior houses accumulated land, followers, and local power. This created a system that could function during periods of strong leadership but became unstable when succession disputes and rivalries intensified. The samurai class was also becoming more socially and culturally diverse. Leading warriors could be sophisticated patrons of art and Zen institutions while still commanding armed retainers. Military government and elite culture were increasingly intertwined. In 1467, a political dispute over succession to the Ashikaga shogunate helped ignite a much wider conflict. Powerful warrior families already had deep rivalries, and Kyoto became the center of fighting between large military coalitions. The struggle is known as the Unin War. It lasted for roughly a decade and devastated much of the capital. Armies occupied neighborhoods, fortified temples and residences, burned buildings, and fought for positions inside the city. Yet the war never produced a clean national victory. When it ended in 1477, the authority of the Ashikaga shogunate had been badly weakened. Regional lords increasingly acted on their own. Local commanders challenged superiors. New families rose while older ones disappeared. The political order became more competitive and more violent. Historians often connect the Unin War with the beginning of the Sengoku period, the age of the country at war. The transition was gradual, but the effect was unmistakable. Japan no longer had a military government capable of consistently controlling the provinces. For the samurai, this created danger and opportunity. Military talent, organization, alliances, taxation, and control of castles could now raise a regional family to national importance. The Sengoku period was an age of competing warlords, but it was not simply endless chaos. Across Japan, ambitious daimyo built stronger regional governments. They surveyed land, regulated markets, organized armies, issued laws, and developed castle towns. Some destroyed former overlords. Others expanded through marriage, diplomacy, or carefully planned campaigns. Warfare grew larger and more organized. Armies included elite mounted samurai, foot soldiers known as a shigaru, archers, spearmen, engineers, and later large numbers of gunners. Loyalty remained important, but it was never automatic. Retainers could change sides, subordinate lords could rebel, and political survival often depended on negotiation as much as courage. Castles changed too. Early mountain fortifications evolved into larger complexes with stone bases, walls, gates, towers, and surrounding towns. These centers helped daimyo control roads, trade, and administration. The period also encouraged social mobility. A talented soldier, administrator, or merchant could sometimes rise far beyond the position of his ancestors. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who would eventually become the most powerful man in Japan, came from unusually modest origins. The world of the samurai was becoming more professional, more bureaucratic, and more dependent on mass armies. A successful Sengoku daimyo needed more than a strong sword arm. He needed taxes, roads, warehouses, officials, secure communications, and disciplined retainers. Castles became the visible centers of this new regional power. Many were placed on mountains or hills that offered defensive advantages, while later complexes increasingly controlled plains, river crossings, and commercial routes. A castle was not only a fortress. It could become the heart of an administrative and economic system. Samurai retainers settled nearby. Merchants and craftsmen supplied the military population. Roads connected the castle town with farms, ports, and neighboring territories. Daimyo issued laws that regulated disputes and defined obligations. They also competed for skilled builders, miners, metalworkers, and weapons makers. The most successful lords understood that warfare depended on economic strength. A large army could not stay in the field without rice, pack animals, transport, and money. This is one reason the Sengoku period produced both destruction and institutional development. Regional governments became more capable because they had to survive constant competition. The great unifiers of the late 16th century would build on these systems rather than starting from nothing. The samurai had become part of a much larger machinery of war and government. The image of samurai warfare often focuses on elite warriors, but large armies depended heavily on foot soldiers. A shigeru had existed earlier, yet their importance increased dramatically during the civil wars of the 15th and 16th centuries. They carried spears, bows, and eventually firearms. Some were temporary levies. Others became experienced professional soldiers attached to powerful houses. Their rise changed the battlefield. Dense infantry formations could defend positions, support cavalry, protect gunners, and fight in coordinated groups. Long spears allowed foot soldiers to challenge mounted opponents. Commanders needed signals, flags, drums, messengers, and clear unit organization to control thousands of men. This reduced the importance of the romantic image of war as a series of individual duels. Personal bravery still mattered, but victory increasingly depended on discipline and organization. Samurai officers commanded units rather than fighting alone. The growth of shigeru forces also created new paths of social mobility. Some men who began in relatively low positions rose through military service. Hideyoshi's career later became the most famous example of this possibility. The Sengoku battlefield was therefore both hierarchical and flexible. It was a place where old warrior traditions survived while mass infantry warfare transformed how campaigns were actually fought. In 1543, Portuguese traders reached the island of Tanegashima and introduced European-style matchlock firearms to Japan. Japanese craftsmen quickly learned how to copy and manufacture the weapon. Within a few decades, guns had become common in the armies of major daimyo. This did not make swords, bows, or spears disappear. Instead, firearms were added to a mixed battlefield system. Matchlocks were useful because soldiers could be trained to fire them effectively in organized units, and their projectiles could penetrate many forms of protection at useful ranges. They also had weaknesses. Rain could make firing difficult, reloading took time, and gunners needed protection from enemy attacks. Japanese commanders developed methods for using firearms behind field defenses and alongside spearmen and archers. Armor changed in response. Some later cuirasses used heavier iron plates, and examples survive with bullet marks used to demonstrate resistance. The arrival of guns is sometimes described as the moment traditional samurai warfare ended. That is too simple. Samurai adopted the new technology rapidly. The ability to change was one of the reasons powerful warrior houses succeeded. Firearms became Japanese weapons because Japanese soldiers, craftsmen, and commanders made them part of their own military system. Among the many daimyo of the Sengoku period, Oda Nobunaga became one of the most important. He inherited control of part of Owari province, but his position was far from secure. Through a combination of battlefield success, political alliances, economic policy, and ruthless decision-making, he expanded his power. Nobunaga supported trade, challenged institutions that resisted his authority, and used large armies equipped with spears and firearms. He also understood the political importance of Kyoto. In 1568, he entered the capital supporting Ashikaga Yoshiaki, who became shogun. The partnership later collapsed, and in 1573 Nobunaga drove Yoshiaki out of Kyoto, effectively ending the Ashikaga shogunate. Nobunaga's reputation became surrounded by dramatic stories, some reliable and others shaped by later legend. What is clear is that he accelerated the process of political unification. He defeated powerful rivals, broke the military strength of major Buddhist institutions that opposed him, and built a network of castles and loyal commanders. His headquarters at Azuchi became a symbol of a new style of lordship. Nobunaga did not complete the unification of Japan, but he changed the scale of what seemed possible. One of the events that made Nobunaga famous occurred in 1560. Imagawa Yoshimoto led a large army into Owari, apparently as part of a campaign that threatened Nobunaga's position. Nobunaga's forces were much smaller. Later stories turned the battle into a near-impossible surprise attack carried out during a storm. The exact numbers and some details remain debated, but the result is not. Nobunaga struck the Imagawa position near Okahazama, and Yoshimoto was killed. The Imagawa army broke apart. The victory transformed Nobunaga's reputation. A regional lord who might have been eliminated instead became a major political force. Okahazama also shows why Sengoku warfare cannot be understood only by counting soldiers. Intelligence, speed, local terrain, command decisions, morale, and timing could change the outcome. Victory also had diplomatic consequences. The weakening of the Imagawa helped Tokugawa Ieyasu, then known as Matsudaira Motoyasu, gain greater independence. Nobunaga and Ieyasu later formed an alliance that would shape the following decades. Okahazama did not unite Japan, but it created the conditions for Nobunaga's rise and for the careers of men who would continue his work. The Battle of Nagashino in 1575 became one of the most famous examples of firearms in samurai history. Forces led by Oda Nobunaga and Tokugawa Ieyasu faced the army of the Takeda clan near Nagashino Castle. The Allied army used large numbers of matchlock gunners and field defenses. Later popular accounts described perfectly organized rotating volleys that destroyed repeated Takeda cavalry charges. Historians have questioned how literally that famous image should be accepted. The surviving evidence supports the importance of firearms and prepared positions, but the battle involved more than one weapon or one tactic. Spears, bows, terrain, fortifications, and coordinated units all mattered. The Takeda forces suffered a major defeat and lost many experienced leaders. The wider lesson is more important than the legend. By the late 16th century, Japanese warfare was highly organized and technologically flexible. Commanders could combine guns with traditional weapons rather than choosing between them. Samurai culture did not reject gunpowder. Major warrior houses invested in it. The battlefield that produced Japan's unification was not a medieval world untouched by new technology. It was a rapidly changing military environment in which adaptation could decide which clans survived. By 1582, Nobunaga controlled much of central Japan and appeared closer than ever to national dominance. Then his rise ended suddenly. One of his commanders, Akechi Mitsuhide, turned against him. Nobunaga was staying at Honnoji Temple in Kyoto, with only a relatively small guard when Mitsuhide's forces surrounded the site. Nobunaga died during the attack. The exact motives behind Mitsuhide's betrayal remain uncertain and have inspired centuries of speculation. Personal resentment, political calculation, fear, and larger conspiracies have all been proposed. What followed is clearer. Mitsuhide expected to take advantage of Nobunaga's death, but another of Nobunaga's commanders moved with remarkable speed. Toyotomi Hideyoshi had been campaigning in western Japan. He negotiated a quick settlement with the enemy he was facing, marched east, defeated Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki, and positioned himself as Nobunaga's most capable successor. Honnoji demonstrates how fragile personal power could be in the Sengoku period. Nobunaga had defeated armies and broken rival institutions, but his political system still depended heavily on the loyalty of powerful commanders. His death did not stop unification. It changed the man who would lead it. Toyotomi Hideyoshi's rise was extraordinary. Unlike many leading daimyo, he did not come from an old family of major warlords. His early life is partly obscured by later stories, but he rose through service under Nobunaga and proved talented in logistics, diplomacy, siege warfare, administration, and political negotiation. After defeating Mitsuhide, Hideyoshi outmaneuvered other rivals within Nobunaga's former coalition. He did not become shogun. Instead, he received high court titles and built a different political structure around his personal authority. Through campaigns and alliances, he brought major regions under his control. The conquest of Shikoku, Kyushu, and finally the Hojo stronghold at Odawara in 1590 completed the military unification of most of Japan. Hideyoshi also carried out major land surveys, which helped define agricultural production and taxation. His government tried to stabilize social categories and reduce the ability of peasants to become independent warriors. The famous sword hunt of 1588 ordered weapons collected from much of the rural population. These policies did not instantly create a rigid modern class system, but they strengthened the distinction between warriors and farmers. Hideyoshi had risen through a fluid age. Once powerful, he helped make that kind of rise more difficult for others. The wars of the 16th century had allowed unusual mobility. Farmers could become soldiers. Soldiers could become officers. Talented retainers could receive land and titles. The process of unification began to reduce that flexibility. Hideyoshi's land surveys identified who held and worked agricultural land. His sword hunt and related orders attempted to separate the population into clearer social roles. Warriors were increasingly expected to live under their lords and to perform military or administrative service rather than farm independently. This transformation continued under the Tokugawa. Over time, samurai became a legally and socially recognized status group. Their privileges included the right to wear paired swords in many contexts, but their lives were also regulated. A samurai owed service to a lord or domain. Income often came through a stipend measured in rice rather than direct control of farmland. Rank differences within the warrior class could be enormous. A powerful daimyo commanded tens or hundreds of thousands of koku of assessed rice production, while a low-ranking retainer might struggle financially. The samurai were becoming more clearly defined at the same moment when the age of constant civil war was ending. That change would eventually create a paradox. Japan's warrior class would reach the height of its formal social status during a long period of peace. After unifying Japan, Hideyoshi launched an enormous overseas war. In 1592, Japanese armies invaded Korea with the stated goal of advancing toward Ming China. The first invasion moved rapidly at the beginning. Japanese forces captured major cities and used their experience with firearms effectively. But the campaign became far more difficult as Korean resistance strengthened, Ming forces intervened, and Japanese supply lines stretched across the sea. Korean naval operations, associated especially with Admiral Lee Sun-sin, disrupted transport and communications. Negotiations followed, but failed to produce a lasting settlement. Hideyoshi ordered a second invasion in 1597. Fighting continued until his death in 1598, after which Japanese forces withdrew. The wars caused enormous destruction and suffering on the Korean peninsula. They also exposed the limits of Hideyoshi's ambitions. Unifying Japan had required control of regional armies and resources. Conquering territory across the sea created a different logistical challenge. For many daimyo, the Korean campaigns were expensive and exhausting. They also placed large armies under commanders who would soon have to decide where their loyalties lay after Hideyoshi's death. The political struggle that followed would bring Tokugawa Ieyasu to the center of power. Tokugawa Ieyasu had survived the violent politics of the Sengoku period for decades. As a young man, he had lived as a political hostage. Later, he became an ally of Nobunaga, a rival and partner of Hideyoshi, and one of the most powerful daimyo in Japan. Hideyoshi's death in 1598 left a young heir, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and a council of senior lords intended to preserve the regime. Tensions quickly grew. Ieyasu built alliances and increased his influence. Opponents feared that he intended to dominate the country. The resulting confrontation divided major daimyo into eastern and western coalitions. Ieyasu was not simply the leader of all former Nobunaga supporters, nor were his enemies a unified ideological bloc. Each side was a complicated network of families with old rivalries and different interests. In 1600, their armies met in one of the most important battles in Japanese history. The Battle of Sekigahara would decide which coalition held the strongest position, but its result depended not only on fighting. Secret negotiations, divided loyalties, and defections would prove just as important as weapons on the field. On October 21, 1600, opposing armies gathered around the narrow valley of Sekigahara. The Eastern Coalition supported Tokugawa Ieyasu. The Western Coalition was associated with Ishida Mitsunari and other leaders who claimed to defend the political order established after Hideyoshi. The battlefield was crowded with contingents commanded by different daimyo. Rain and difficult ground added to the confusion. Fighting began in the morning and remained uncertain for hours. The decisive moment came when Tokugawa Ieyasu, positioned with a large force on the western side, attacked former allies rather than Ieyasu's army. Other defections followed. The western position collapsed. Mitsunari was later captured and executed. Sekigahara did not instantly remove every rival to Tokugawa power, but it transformed the political balance. Ieyasu rewarded supporters and reduced or relocated opponents. He redistributed large amounts of land, placing trusted houses in strategically important regions. 3 years later, in 1603, the emperor granted him the title of shogun. A new military government was established in Edo. The Tokugawa system would prove far more durable than the political arrangements created by Nobunaga or Hideyoshi. The Tokugawa shogunate created a political order that lasted for more than 2.5 centuries. The country remained divided into domains ruled by daimyo, but the shogunate controlled key cities, major roads, foreign relations, and strategically important lands. Daimyo were classified partly by their relationship to the Tokugawa house. Some were close hereditary allies. Others had submitted only after Sekigahara and were watched more carefully. The system known as alternate attendance required many daimyo to spend regular periods in Edo while maintaining residences there. Their families often remained connected to the capital, increasing political control and imposing major financial costs. Castles and marriage alliances were regulated. Roads improved as large processions moved between domains and Edo. The Tokugawa did not eliminate local government. Domains retained substantial administrative authority. Instead, Japan developed a layered system in which shogunal and domain institutions worked together and competed. The samurai remained the ruling status group within this order. Yet the great irony was that prolonged peace reduced the need for battlefield service. Warrior families now had to justify their privileged position through administration, education, ceremony, policing, and loyalty to the political system. Peace changed what it meant to be a samurai. During the Edo period, many warriors spent their lives in castle towns rather than on campaign. They worked as clerks, magistrates, accountants, teachers, guards, inspectors, and domain officials. Some studied law, history, Confucian philosophy, mathematics, medicine, or military theory. The sword remained an important symbol of status, but a large number of samurai rarely used one in combat. Income was often paid as a fixed stipend. This could create serious financial problems because prices changed while official incomes did not always keep pace. Some samurai borrowed from merchants, took side work, taught martial arts, or produced crafts. Wealthy urban merchants could become economically stronger than low-ranking warriors, even though merchants ranked below samurai in official status theory. This gap between status and money became one of the contradictions of Tokugawa society. Samurai education also expanded. Domain schools trained young warriors in reading, ethics, administration, and military subjects. The long peace did not make the warrior class irrelevant. It transformed military households into a governing class. By the 19th century, however, That same transformation would make it easier for a modern state to replace hereditary warriors with professional institutions. Today, samurai are often associated with bushido, usually translated as the way of the warrior. It is tempting to imagine that every samurai across 7 centuries followed one fixed code. History is more complicated. Medieval warriors valued loyalty, courage, reputation, family interest, reward, religious belief, and personal honor, but these values could conflict. Warriors changed sides. Families rebelled against superiors. Political survival often mattered as much as abstract principle. During the peaceful Edo period, thinkers wrote more systematically about how a warrior should behave when daily life no longer revolved around war. Different domains and authors emphasized different ideals. Confucian duty, discipline, learning, frugality, martial readiness, and service became important themes. Famous texts such as Hagakure came from particular times and places and did not function as a universal rulebook for all samurai. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, writers helped create a more unified modern image of bushido. That image became influential in Japan and abroad. The historical reality is therefore not that bushido was fake. Warrior ethics were real and important. The mistake is treating centuries of changing ideas as one unchanging code practiced identically by every samurai. No object is more closely associated with the samurai than the Japanese sword. Yet its importance changed over time. Early mounted warriors often relied heavily on bows, and later battlefields were dominated by spears, firearms, and organized infantry. Still, swords remained important sidearms and powerful symbols of warrior identity. Swordsmiths developed highly sophisticated methods of forging blades, controlling carbon, shaping steel, and producing hard cutting edges supported by tougher metal structures. The visible temper line, or hamon, became both a technical feature and an aesthetic one. Blades were mounted in different styles, depending on period and use. A tachi was typically suspended edge down, while the later katana was commonly worn edge up through the belt. During the Edo period, the paired sword set, usually a long and short blade, became strongly associated with samurai status. Fine fittings, guards, scabbards, and decorative metalwork could be works of art. A famous blade might carry the reputation of its maker for generations. Yet the sword's cultural importance should not erase the rest of samurai warfare. The sword became the most recognizable symbol partly because the class survived long after large battlefield campaigns had become rare. Samurai society was not made only by men on battlefields. Women in warrior families played essential roles in household management, inheritance, marriage alliances, education, and the preservation of family property. Their responsibilities varied greatly by period and rank. In earlier medieval Japan, some women could inherit or manage estates, although these rights became more restricted in many areas over time. During warfare, women might help defend residences or castles, especially when male retainers were absent. Weapons such as the naginata later became strongly associated with women of samurai households, though the historical picture is more varied than modern stereotypes suggest. Marriage was often political. A daughter of one warrior family could strengthen an alliance with another domain, and elite marriages were carefully negotiated. During the Edo period, women in high-ranking samurai families lived within strict social expectations, but they could still influence household politics, education, finances, and succession. Letters and records show that they were active participants in family strategy. The popular term onabugeisha is often used today for female warriors, but it can oversimplify many different experiences. The broader truth is more important. Samurai households depended on women as organizers, property managers, political links, and defenders of family continuity. Few individual samurai became as famous as Miyamoto Musashi. Born around 1584, Musashi lived through the final decades of the Sengoku age and the beginning of Tokugawa peace. Stories about his life describe numerous duels, travels, and encounters with rival schools. Some details are difficult to verify because later legend grew around his reputation. Musashi is traditionally associated with a two-sword method of fighting and with the Nidin Ichiryu school. His most famous written work, The Book of Five Rings, was completed near the end of his life in 1645. It discusses strategy through the language of martial practice, but its ideas are broader than sword technique alone. Musashi writes about timing, observation, adaptability, psychology, and the need to understand both one's own method and the methods of opponents. He was also associated with painting and calligraphy, reminding us that samurai culture could combine martial and artistic disciplines. Musashi became an ideal subject for novels, films, manga, and television, which often blurred history and legend. His lasting fame reflects a larger pattern. As battlefield warfare faded, the image of the highly skilled individual swordsman became even more important in Japanese cultural memory. One of the most famous stories of the Edo period concerns 47 former retainers of the Akio domain. In 1701, their lord, Asano Naganori, attacked a court official named Kira Yashinaka inside Edo Castle. Drawing a weapon in the shogun's residence was a serious offense. Asano was ordered to die by seppuku, and his domain was confiscated. His retainers became ronin, samurai without a lord. Nearly 2 years later, a group led by Oishi Kuranosuke attacked Kira's residence and killed him. They then surrendered to the authorities. In 1703, they were ordered to die by seppuku. The event immediately raised difficult questions. Were the ronin loyal retainers fulfilling a moral duty, or had they violated public law and threatened the peace? Writers, theater producers, and later filmmakers transformed the incident into one of Japan's best-known loyalty stories. The famous drama Chishingura changed names and details to avoid censorship while preserving the emotional structure. The historical case is valuable because it shows the tension inside Tokugawa samurai values. Warriors were expected to be loyal, yet the shogunate also demanded obedience to law. The two duties could point in different directions. The long Tokugawa peace did not erase martial culture. It changed where that culture appeared. Samurai practiced swordsmanship, archery, spear fighting, horsemanship, and later forms of jujitsu in schools that preserved and systematized techniques. At the same time, many studied poetry, calligraphy, tea, painting, philosophy, and classical literature. Elite warrior families collected expensive armor even when it was unlikely to be worn in battle. Ceremonial suits became displays of lineage and craftsmanship. Helmets could carry dramatic crests designed to make a commander recognizable. Martial schools also became social institutions where teachers passed traditions to students through licenses and written transmissions. Some styles emphasized practical combat. Others increasingly treated training as a method of discipline and self-cultivation. The samurai world was therefore not divided neatly between warrior and scholar. Many households valued both. This combination had deep roots in earlier shogunal culture, when military leaders patronized Zen monks, poets, painters, and tea masters. By the 18th century, an educated samurai official might spend far more time with documents than weapons. Yet he still belonged to a class whose social identity was built around the memory of military service. By the 19th century, the Tokugawa order faced growing pressure. Japan had never been completely isolated from the world. Trade and information continued through controlled channels, especially with Dutch and Chinese merchants at Nagasaki, and through relations with Korea, the Ryukyu Kingdom, and the Ainu. But the shogunate restricted most foreign contact. Western naval power was expanding across East Asia, and Japanese officials increasingly worried about coastal defense. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry arrived at Uraga with United States warships and a letter demanding the opening of relations. The steam-powered vessels became known in Japan as black ships. Perry returned in 1854 with a larger force, and the shogunate signed the Treaty of Kanagawa. Additional treaties followed. The issue divided the political elite. Some leaders argued that Japan needed foreign technology and time to strengthen itself. Others demanded resistance and rallied around the slogan of revering the emperor and expelling the foreigners. The shogunate's authority suffered because it appeared unable to control the crisis on its own terms. Samurai from powerful Western domains became central to the political struggle that followed. The final years of Tokugawa rule would be among the most turbulent since the Sengoku period. The final years of the Tokugawa shogunate are known as the Bakumatsu period. Politics became dangerous and unpredictable. Foreign treaties, economic disruption, succession disputes, court politics, and regional rivalries all combined. Activists from domains such as Choshu and Satsuma challenged the shogunate. Some supported attacks on foreigners. Others came to believe that Japan had to adopt Western weapons, ships, and military organization in order to survive. These positions could change quickly as events proved old assumptions wrong. Choshu forces clashed with foreign naval powers and learned how vulnerable traditional defenses could be. Satsuma also fought a British fleet at Kagoshima in 1863, then expanded its engagement with Western technology. Former enemies eventually cooperated. In 1866, Satsuma and Choshu formed an alliance aimed at reducing Tokugawa power. Political violence continued in Kyoto, where samurai groups, domain troops, and shogunal security forces competed for influence. The imperial court became increasingly important as a source of legitimacy. In 1867, the last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, returned governing authority to the emperor in an attempt to shape the coming political order. The move did not prevent war. Japan was about to enter a final conflict between the old shogunal system and a new imperial government. The Boshin War began in 1868. Forces supporting the new imperial government fought troops loyal to the former Tokugawa order. The conflict showed how much Japanese warfare had changed. Both sides used modern rifles, artillery, military drill, steamships, and imported equipment alongside older weapons and uniforms. At the Battle of Tobafushimi near Kyoto, imperial forces defeated a larger shogunal army. Political defections followed. Edo surrendered without the massive urban battle many had feared, although resistance continued in northern Japan. Former shogunate supporters created new coalitions and eventually withdrew to Hokkaido, where they established the short-lived Republic of Ezo. Imperial forces defeated the final resistance at Hakodate in 1869. The war was relatively brief compared with the great civil conflicts of earlier centuries, but its political meaning was enormous. The Tokugawa shogunate was gone. The new government ruled in the name of the young Emperor Meiji. Many of the men directing that government were themselves samurai from victorious domains. Their goal, however, was not to restore medieval warrior rule. They wanted to build a centralized state capable of competing with the industrial powers that had forced Japan to open its ports. The leaders of the Meiji government moved quickly to dismantle the political system that had supported the samurai class. In 1871, the old domains were abolished and replaced by prefectures controlled by the central government. A national conscript army was created in 1873, breaking the hereditary warrior class's traditional claim to military service. Samurai stipends placed a heavy burden on government finances, so they were gradually converted into bonds. In 1876, regulations restricted the wearing of swords in public for most former samurai. These reforms did not erase warrior families overnight. Former samurai entered the new army, police, schools, government offices, business, journalism, and politics. Some adapted successfully. Others lost income and status. The emotional impact was enormous because privileges that had defined families for generations disappeared within a few years. The new state also adopted Western military technology and institutions while presenting itself as a restoration of imperial rule. In a historical irony, many former samurai were responsible for abolishing the samurai order. They believed Japan needed national institutions rather than thousands of separate hereditary military households. The class that had dominated politics for centuries was being absorbed into a modern state. Resistance from dissatisfied former samurai erupted several times during the 1870s. The largest conflict was the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877. Seigo Takamori, one of the leading figures of the Meiji Restoration, had resigned from the central government after a political dispute in 1873. He returned to Kagoshima, where private schools attracted many former samurai. When tensions with the government escalated, thousands joined a rebellion under Seigo's leadership. The conflict has often been romanticized as a final stand of swords against rifles. In reality, the rebels also used modern firearms and artillery. The decisive difference was scale and resources. The new national government could mobilize conscript soldiers, money, rail and shipping networks, modern weapons, and a centralized command structure. After months of hard fighting, the rebellion collapsed. Seigo died during the final fighting around Shiroyama in September 1877. The defeat demonstrated that hereditary regional warrior forces could no longer challenge the modern state successfully. Yet Seigo quickly became a heroic figure in popular memory, admired even by many who supported the government. The samurai class had lost its formal political position, but the cultural power of samurai stories was already taking on a new life. The samurai did not disappear from memory when their legal status ended. Their history was retold through schoolbooks, novels, theater, prints, military writing, film, television, manga, games, and global popular culture. Some modern images are based on real features of warrior life. Others combine traditions from very different centuries. A mounted archer of the Genpei War, a Sengoku gun commander, an Edo bureaucrat, and a 19th-century rebel were all samurai, but they did not live by identical rules or fight in identical ways. That variety is the most important part of the story. The samurai survived for so long because the class changed with Japan. Warriors became land managers, military governors, daimyo, administrators, scholars, and eventually participants in the creation of the modern state that ended their privileges. Their armor and swords remain extraordinary examples of craftsmanship, but those objects tell only part of the history. Samurai power rested on organization, family networks, land, law, administration, education, and political adaptation as much as battlefield skill. For nearly 7 centuries, warrior governments shaped Japan. The class eventually vanished, but the institutions, art, stories, and myths created around it continue to influence how the world imagines Japan today.